The National Schools Debating Championships 2022 would like to thank our premier partners, the Australian National University and Crimson Education, our major partner, the University of Canberra Faculty of Business, Government and Law, and our sponsor, Speaking Schools Australasia, for their support in making this tournament happen.
When you, as a privileged white girl, could tan your skin to the point of blackfishing, and yet you had experienced none of the racial discrimination that group faced on a daily basis. When Bella Hadid's mum had pressured her into getting a nose job that erased her cultural and racial identity at the age of just 14 so that she could succeed in the modelling industry. When Asian women faced constant fetishization at the hands of pale, stale males, the racial procedures that caused and exacerbated these issues had to be banned. We under Affirmative will do this. This looks like banning both medical and temporary procedures such as nose jobs, skin lightening and darkening, the fox eye lift, lip plumping, and non-protective or traditional box braids on white girls. So, how does these kind of things impact beauty standards? We think that those that undergo these kind of procedures are, firstly, people from minority groups that have these procedures to fit these Eurocentric beauty standards because they grow up in a media, in a society that tells them you are beautiful when your nose is straight, not when it's hooked. So they undergo these procedures to fit in to a beauty standard that does not accept them otherwise. We think that you also undergo these procedures when you're the person part of a majority group, such as white girls, that do it for an appearance that they like, such as darker skin, or do it when they have perverse incentives, such as mocking that minority group. This looks like tanning or going to the point of blackface. We thought that also the people that underwent these procedures were the most privileged people who had access to this kind of surgery because you couldn't afford a safe surgery when you were in a developing country. We don't think that means that you didn't still face the consequences of these procedures when you were, say, in Africa, because we think the skin lightening was so prevalent there. No, thank you. From the age of 8, you were pressured into lightening your skin with toxic carcinogens that would harm you later in your life. So, how do these kind of issues manifest in society? We think that firstly it comes out in the media, the advertising of products that would make you more beautiful, the glamorization of procedures, such as the fact that going under surgery, going under anaesthetic is so normalised, getting a BBL is so normalised, people don't realise that they can literally risk their life. Yes?
Would you ban all plastic surgery?
Okay, we don't think that all plastic surgery necessarily fits under this, but if there is a blurry grey area where getting a certain kind of surgery may have racial motivations, we will find a ban that. We think that generally plastic surgery says that you are facing some kind of insecurity or you're pressured into it because of the ideals and the Western beauty standards that you're pushed into. This is why we will find to ban it if there was that grey area. Okay, so how else does this manifest in society? We think it's also in the representation of models, in that other people, like models of other ethnic groups, no thank you, may still be represented, but they're represented after they have surgery, after they get a forehead reduction, after they get their lips plumped, after they get a nose job, then you see them on the catwalk. So we also think it comes out in TikToks and trends, and there are trends every other week of showing how straight your nose is, of showing how full your lips are. That was incredibly harmful when you didn't fit into that group. And the views and the likes that you saw on certain TikToks of people that did fit into this group had millions of views, and the girls that didn't fit into that group, no thank you, had maybe 50. That was incredibly harmful for you. So, how else do we think this manifests? We think it's also manifests in the products that are created and pushed on you from a young age. This looks like companies, firstly, creating racially biased products within countries, and even in the sense that even if a company does not have racial intentions in the first place, it's then regulated to that point. This looks like the facts that the Dove whitening skincare that was pushed onto Asian communities was banned across the world and stopped being manufactured, and yet Bondi Sands Ultra Dark is still being pushed because that was accepted. So, how else do we see this happening? We think it happens in social circles as well, in your manifestation and perception of beauty standards, in that white skin is incredibly popular within Asian and African countries, and yet dark skin is popular within Australia. So it has a lot to do with your perception of these ideals. We think it also looks like your ability to change your appearance. That meant the companies naturally targeted areas that you couldn't otherwise achieve. They naturally targeted insecurities that you could only actually achieve that certain beauty standard when you had that surgery, when you had that procedure that was incredibly harmful for you. We think that also note that people that were so susceptible to media and advertising, they followed it. We think that it wasn't, the opposition couldn't stand up and say, oh, the media didn't really affect people, they could decide for themselves. No, you were pressured into this because when you're constantly seeing it throughout the media, you follow these trends. That's why we had increased numbers of surgeries in recent years, because these trends were increasing in number. So why was this so harmful? Firstly, because it plays into natural insecurities. We think that when you grew up in certain communities, when you never heard that your nose wasn't beautiful, you were able to achieve an adult life that was actually fulfilled, because you always were able to see yourself as pretty. But when you grew up in a society that constantly pushed media advertising onto you, that told you, you know what, you're really insecure about your nose because the media and TikTok tells you it's not pretty. Well, guess what? I'll provide you with a surgical change to that nose, and then you can achieve that life. So people are always going to undergo these surgeries under the opposition. This is so important in the debate because self-esteem was so important to your ability to just live a normal human life.
Fine.
Because, yes.
Given that beauty standards exist under both sides, isn't it at least a good thing that you can attain them under ours?
Okay. Why was it a good thing that when you were 16 in a Jewish community, it was an accepted fact that you would go and get a nose job? The fact was, sure, insecurities existed under both sides, but when you gave people an outlet to actually take that under, you told them, you know what, you don't like your nose, change it, you should change it. That was the pushed ideal. It was never just that you stopped having an insecurity, it was always that you followed that on. Okay, so why do these procedures increase discrimination against these groups? We think that you are discriminated, and there's been a long history of discrimination on the basis of appearance. This is an extremely long history in that when, in Australia, the simulation policy came in, they had photos that were presented to the public of what a good First Nations person should look like once they were mixed into and assimilated into society, because they didn't accept these people who were already beautiful, that their humanity was already fulfilled. We think also that it's very complex in its racial discrimination because people took certain aspects of appearance that were changing their appearances and glamorized this as beautiful, that this straight nose was beautiful, but the other features that came with that race were discarded and abandoned because they didn't like those appearances. So only certain aspects were glamorized, others were abandoned. This pushed the perceptions that these other features were ugly. So they take these pretty features and they abandon the others. This means that the group of people within this racial group that don't actually have any features that fit into this small 1% of features that are deemed beautiful are then abandoned and left behind. They always feel ugly and they always think, I can only ever achieve this certain standard if I actually change my appearance. That was incredibly harmful because no, there wasn't like every single person in a certain racial group had that one perfect feature. No, there were several people who were left behind because they didn't have those features. They felt that even though their race might be discriminated against, they would never even fit into that small percentage of people that were glamorized. So, why does this increase discrimination? We think that people of oppressed groups who don't undergo this procedure can never feel beautiful under the opposition's world. We also thought that it pushed a narrative that it was so much easier for just an average white girl to achieve that pretty standard on TikTok, that if you had tan hair and straight blonde, tan skin and straight blonde hair, you would achieve that beauty standard. Whereas, when you were Asian or when you were black, you had to achieve that perfect level to even get any sort of recognition. There were literally TikTok trends dedicated to people talking about how this affected their life. Panel, at the end of this speech, you need to know 3 things. Firstly, that we never stood for a world in which society's most marginalised communities were left behind. Secondly, that these procedures led to a complete degradation and appropriation of culture. And finally, the side affirmative was the only one who could ever tell racial minorities that they too were beautiful.
The people who were the most marginalised, who academic discourse about identity claim to help and protect, don't care about theory, about jargon, about norm shifting, because they don't have time and they don't have the mental energy to do so, because they're just trying to survive. The unfortunate reality of the status quo is that racism exists, and it was always better to help people move within that unfortunate reality as comfortably as possible by providing them with a tangible reprieve from racism and discrimination by allowing them to undertake these procedures. We'd always prefer this to using people as social battering rams to dismantle racism in the long term. We'd always prefer this to having people suffer in the now and die waiting for long-term change. That's why we're so incredibly proud to oppose. A couple of things in this speech First, a few points of rebuttal, then 2 substantive contributions, but first, a few things to note in setup. First question is, what do these procedures look like? We agree that they're about changing your racial appearance, whether that's through changing your facial proportions through things such as rhinoplasty or double eyelid surgery, and also things like skin whitening. No, thank you. Second question in substantive then, who will be undertaking these procedures? We think the vast majority of people undertaking these procedures will be people of colour trying to attain some standard of whiteness, because that's the direction social pressures and the society we lives in pushes them to. We don't think many people will be trying to we don't think many white people will be trying to change race in the same industrial, in the same vast numbers. So we think many of their points about this are have very minimal impact. Final question in setup then, what do we propose? Firstly, it's important to note that to the extent access issue exists, we'd be more than willing to make these procedures more accessible and affordable. And secondly, we would be more than willing to regulate these procedures to make them incredibly safe, as we do with all medical procedures. Importantly, side affirmative cannot do this because you cannot regulate something you have banned. Okay, now on to 2 points of rebuttal. Their first point was about perpetuating racist beauty standards. The important thing to note here is that racism permeates throughout all of society. It's a massive superstructure that exists anyway. Cosmetic surgery was only a small avenue for achieving this. Therefore, banning it would have minimal impact and the racism would still exist anyway. People would still feel have low self-esteem because of racist pressure, and they'd still be pressured to undertake these surgeries. Then they had some stuff to say about coercion and how people will be pressurised. First response to this is to say that these procedures aren't coercive, it's a rational choice to undertake them because people know what they need to do to survive in a racist world. I'll talk about this more in my substantive. Secondly, as we told you, coercion exists under both sides because racism still exists, beauty standards still exist through other avenues like editing, through all other avenues of white supremacy. This is a very small way to do this. But thirdly, and really importantly, even if this policy was coercive, they needed to prove that people were being coerced into making a bad decision. And they're not being coerced into making a bad decision. At the point, they're saving themselves from the horrors of racial discrimination and abuse. I'll touch on this more in my substantive. And they made a substantial concession when we POI'd them about whether they'd ban plastic surgery, when they said they'd allow it in some instances. Because again, when women undertake plastic surgery, they're perpetuating unattainable beauty standards, they're perpetuating fat phobia, they're perpetuating the sexualisation of women, but we still allow them to do this because it allows them to survive in society. No, thank you. Then the second point was about discrimination against people of colour. Again, we think this is largely symmetrical because racism still exists. We tell you we prevent this discrimination because we make beauty standards more attainable to everyone and more accessible, and also provide tangible benefits to people of colour.
Point of information.
Sure.
Once this technology has been adopted for hundreds of years, what does your side of the house actually look like?
We would always prefer to prioritise people in the here and now, and the truth is, when you say something like hundreds of years, long-term norm shifting will take that time. We'd rather provide people with temporary reprieve from racism and discrimination now than allow them to die waiting for maybe some change in 100 years' time, which is a very uncertain possibility considering how entrenched white supremacy is. First point, if substantive, why do we support people's right to undergo these procedures? First, I'm going to talk a bit about choice. People have a fundamental right to alter their appearance the way they want to, because firstly, your appearance is a fundamental part of your being. It is something you should be able to have control over, that the state should not take control over. Secondly, people have a right to bodily autonomy. They have ownership over their body, and it's absolutely tyrannical for the state to tell them what to do with it. In response to all their material about how choices harm people, again, racism is a superstructure that permeates all society. Surgery makes a minimal impact on this. You taking this action doesn't alter other people's decision to make this choice. And it's contingent upon practical outcomes. In terms of consent, people can consent to these procedures because it's a rational choice they're making to be able to survive in a racist society. For example, women are coerced into not being able to walk at night, but we wouldn't discourage them from doing that just because they're not actively resisting the patriarchy. It's silly to say they're enforcing it because it's always better for them to preserve their personal safety than worry about norms shifting in the long term. This was a valid choice. Some other things on consent, we think the prevalence of these procedures, as we've noted, means people have a very good idea of what they involve. They can see before and after pictures, they can conceptualise the consequences, so this is a very informed decision. Thirdly, we'd say often these procedures are reversible, so the harms of them are not very much. Sure.
Would you stand by the fetishisation of Asian women that followed the rise of anime cosplay?
We'd say that people, as I told you in my setup, we'd say that white people trying to alter racial appearances, like the negative social consequence. No one wants to buy in, no white person would want to relinquish their privilege and try and become someone of another race. So we think like that's a really minimal consideration in this debate. At the end of this point, we've proved that people had a fundamental right to undergo this procedure, regardless of practical outcomes. Therefore, a policy that bans like racially altering procedures is fundamentally illegitimate. We win on principle alone. Second point of substantive then is why this procedure is good for the people who undergo it. So as side affirmative would agree, the life experience of people, members of racial minorities is incredibly terrible. They feel dissatisfied with their appearance, they feel downtrodden because of beauty standards, and children grow up hating themselves because of pernicious social messaging that tells them their physical appearance is inferior. Additionally, they're discriminated against because of their physical appearance. A white-looking candidate will always get a job above someone who is less close to whiteness. They're perceived as undesirable, they can't find a romantic partner because of pernicious Eurocentric beauty standards, they're profiled for their racial appearance, etc., etc. We fix this because we allow people to gain immediate and tangible relief from their racist society by allowing them to an extent to buy into whiteness. This means we increase people's self-esteem and allow them to feel beautiful for the first time in their lives and feel better about themselves. It means people are more able to find a romantic partner, but really importantly, more able to get a job and achieve financial security because of that. They're able to avoid homelessness and fulfill their dreams by gaining employment in a way that is unique to our side. They're also able to avoid hate crimes and appearance-based discrimination. Note that we'd always prioritise this immediate relief from the real impacts of racism rather than norm shifting. Why? It's because norm shifting didn't happen overnight. It was incremental, it was long-term. We'd rather people gain benefits in the now than die waiting for them to maybe or maybe not accrue, and also getting a job was far more important than maybe ending racism in the future. And note then on underground things and the black market, when people see the practical benefits to this procedure that we've made so very clear, or if you buy affirmative's characterisation that this procedure is coercive, people have an active incentive to try and access it, even if it is banned. That means that people in their world are getting these procedures in incredibly dangerous environments, for example, flying to Thailand, and in doing so dying during these procedures in far greater rates due to unsanitary medical equipment, due to surgeries being botched. And that's exacerbated by the fact that people won't seek medical assistance when this happens. They'll be afraid to get help because they're scared of legal repercussions. We prevent this under our side by not banning it and also making it more accessible. So at the end of this point, and at the end of this speech, we actively help thousands of people of colour increase their self-esteem, be treated with respect, improve their standing in society, and deal with the unfortunate reality of the status quo. But even if we gain no practical benefits, it was still bad to ban this procedure because the ban carries unique safety harms and means far more people are getting this procedure in far worse and far more dangerous ways, so incredibly proud to oppose.
Panel, let's actually think about what opposition has just told you for 8 minutes. They've told you there is a huge issue in society. Their solution to discrimination is for people to undergo procedures that change who they are as a person so that they escape persecution. They have told these racial minorities that it is their fault that they have been discriminated against by society, and it is their responsibility to change how they look so that they can look white, so that they can join the rest of this white-looking community and therefore escape the discrimination they have been suffering their entire life. Put this in another context. That is like telling someone who is overweight that it is their problem and that therefore they should give themselves an eating disorder so that they can solve the issue of being fat shamed instead of trying to fix the problem in society that we base how beautiful you are based on a number on a scale. Couple of questions in this speech. But firstly, just a note on plastic surgery. We're very happy to just ban all cosmetic surgery if that's what opposition wants to make this debate about, but we just didn't think that that was something within the scope of this debate that we should be discussing today. So, what did they tell you in terms of a principled reason as to why this surgery shouldn't be allowed? They tell you have freedom of choice and bodily autonomy and all of that stuff. Couple of issues with this. Firstly, your freedom of choice only exists to an extent, right? We see that throughout the entirety of society. That's why you can't go around and like say whatever you want. That's why we have the Hate Speech Act. That's why you can't go around and just like punch people at will, because it harms them. You have freedom of choice to the extent that it harms other people who haven't consented to whatever action you're taking. That means that this debate isn't actually in any way principally, like this point doesn't actually stand principally. This entire debate is contingent because they have to prove that harm doesn't come to other people from this action that you are taking and that you are not actively harming other people. So, let's have a look firstly at who takes these procedures, because they tell you a couple of things. Firstly, that the majority of people undergoing procedures are from oppressed minority groups, because God, why would someone who's white want to ever change their appearance? We just didn't think this was empirically true, right? The people who bought Bondi Sands were white. The people who got like lip plumping were white. Like, there were just people who took a lot of procedures who were white empirically, if you look at society, because they had to stand for the status quo, right? It wasn't some alternate world they were creating. We think that what's especially harmful about this is that people from Anglo-Saxon communities take certain aspects of other groups, because they look at the African American communities and they go, I really want plump lips, and they take only that aspect and they only glamorize that aspect, and they tell you that only that one aspect of this race is beautiful, but I'm gonna leave the rest. Okay? That was incredibly harmful. But secondly, they like tell you that it becomes super accessible under their world because like they'll fund it through like Medicare and stuff, and now everyone can access like this cosmetic surgery. Firstly, people across the world just didn't have access to like Medicare. Like, this healthcare system in Sierra Leone was struggling to cope with like people hit by a car or people who just needed a course of antibiotics. They weren't going to be able to like dole out like, you know, chemically changing the color of your skin or like nose jobs to every like man and his dog. That just wasn't feasible. You can't get the whole world to look like one certain race. That meant that you had to engage in a world where some people are left behind. And that was incredibly worse. I'll explain that later on. But they also tell you that this is like a choice that I'll take you in a moment that you've consented to because it's a rational choice. We didn't think that when Bella Hadid was 14 and her mum pressured her into getting a nose job, when you were Jewish and everyone at the age of 16 got a nose job, it was a choice you consented to. There were plenty of choices you were forced into by society because society told you that was the right thing to do. Yes.
Given that beauty standards existed for millennia before these procedures did, how are these procedures the root of all beauty standards in the world?
Yeah, okay, we're not saying that in our world we create a utopia where everyone thinks everyone is super beautiful. What we're saying is that we don't continue to entrench these racial beauty standards. We don't continue to make the problem worse. We don't have to prove we get some perfect utopia where everyone loves everyone. We just have to prove that our world is better than your world when you continue to entrench these standards that wasn't our burden. So, let's look at who actually helps these minorities. Because they tell you that you're allowed to now save yourself from this acute violence and this discrimination. Couple of issues. Firstly, I told you why not everyone uses this, because not everyone has access to it. But also, we didn't think that everyone necessarily wanted to change the way they looked. I was perfectly happy with the way that I looked, so I wasn't going to undertake this racially changing surgery. That was okay. There were always going to be people who didn't undergo this surgery. With that in mind, let's have a look what happens to those people, because they are now further oppressed, because they are a smaller minority, because they are now seen as more as outcasts by society, because they don't look like the majority of the population. Because now it's seen as the fact that there is something wrong with it. That was hugely harmful for those minorities because it was much easier to persecute them, because they were a smaller group and because they didn't have a support community. But aside from all that, which keep in mind as a group, they brought you no benefits, they just told you didn't exist, and that group very clearly existed. Why did they bring harm to the people who underwent this surgery anyway? Because you didn't completely change who you were as a person. You still had an accent. You still had aspects to your personality that led to the belief of that allowed someone to figure out which ethnicity you were. You still had identification documents, right? not everyone was all of a sudden like becoming American and like becoming Anglo-Saxon. Like that just wasn't feasible within this debate. We're talking about people who just get a nose job, or people who like box braid their hair, or people who tan or whiten their skin. Like that just wasn't what we were talking about. That meant that they never actually solved the racism for these people because they continue to be persecuted by police. They continue to suffer under the institutions which they spent all of First Speaker telling you were so harmful, under the society that they spent First Speaker telling you were so harmful. But they also just like ignored our POI that we told you about the like harms of like fetishization onto like Asian women after Anglo-Saxon women like supported this rise and popularization of anime cosplay. Because those other women did not consent to this fetishization, because this was not something that they wanted pushed onto them, but it was because other people had chosen to undergo these racially altering surgeries. So, final question in this speech. Why do these procedures cause cultural erosion? Because we think culture is very important because of the community it allows you to be a part of, because of the traditions and like beliefs that it allows you to support, and the way that it makes your life more fulfilling, but also the fact that preservation of culture allows you the choice to engage with this culture. What happened in their world is that this culture was misunderstood, was glorified. What happened is that people got like protective box braids that made their hair fall out because they didn't actually understand why someone got box braids. They didn't actually understand these like cultural beliefs and traditions. That was hugely harmful because it meant that this culture became a wash. It meant that it lost its preservation and that it wasn't there into the future. That was hugely harmful for members of this culture, for members of that racial minority. What I proved to you in this speech is that there are always going to be people left behind because you couldn't make the entire world look British. That it was incredibly harmful for those people who now suffered so much more discrimination at the hands of society, and that it was harmful for the people who changed anyway. It was not up to opposition to just tell them that the solution to discrimination was to change who they were fundamentally.
They probably don't change beauty standards in any meaningful way. The one apparent harm that exists in that case then is if an individual having plastic surgery that alters their appearance ultimately impacts others. That is the legs that their case stands on. So I'm going to spend the first half of my speech proving to you why fundamentally an individual making that choice doesn't impact others in any harmful way. A few reasons. Firstly, they continue to generalize what individuals are actually like this today. That is to say, not every single person is susceptible to the beauty standards that tell people what to look like. We think probably some people are insecure, but those are the same people who are oppressed by those beauty standards in either world. Another individual having that plastic surgery probably doesn't change the way they look at themselves in any meaningful way, because they are already to some extent victims of the beauty standards that they themselves tell you will still exist under their side. But secondly, we think it is fundamentally important to prioritize the individuals who feel insecure in themselves to make that change in a meaningful way. But we think that the result of that is that you can have probably more discussion and just more awareness about plastic surgery and what that means and what that looks like for different individuals. Not the alternative is probably just people feeling very insecure, but then having no avenue for discussion. We think just like the ability to talk about what these beauty standards are and how it impacts different groups is probably incredibly important. But thirdly, note that racism existed before these beauty standards and procedures and things like that, which means that people have, because like the oppressive white regime and things like that just always has existed, people have always been told that the way they look is harmful. We don't think that necessarily changes when you allow these procedures to exist. But let's be very, very clear. Even if the harm that they can claim about other individuals feeling harmed by these beauty standards continues to exist, we ultimately didn't care when we could weigh it out with all of the practical material about how we actively change the individual's lives. That is to say, being pressured by some extent by individuals having plastic surgery is an incrementally less harm than many, many people in society feeling better about themselves, having better self-esteem, literally being able to access a job because of the way they looked. We were ultimately willing to trade off the harms of some people feeling some further pressure about these beauty standards when the impact of literally changing people's self-esteems and their lives was far more important. Okay, 3 questions in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about choice of beauty standards and what's oppressive. Then I'm going to talk about why these procedures are good and why the ban is actively worse. And then I'm going to talk about why we change narratives about race more generally. On the first, choice versus beauty standards. They tell us there are oppressive beauty metrics that are perpetuated through things like media and modeling. Two responses to this. Firstly, they themselves admit that they do not change these things, so it probably doesn't matter in the broader scale of the debate. What matters is which side solidifies these beauty standards in more significant ways. I'm going to talk about that later offline. But I think it's important to note that their example of Bella Hadid being forced to have plastic surgery at 14 is not something we have to cop in this debate. We don't have to support parents literally forcing their children to undergo operations against their own free will. Obviously, that is not the type of thing we have to support. We do support Bella Hadid after turning 18, like having insecurities about herself and then wanting to change that. Because we think if she felt that she was going to get oppressed because of the way she looked, and she didn't want to rely on an upward trajectory of change, she fundamentally had the right to make that, to better her life here and now. That was a right she had. She didn't just have to wait. But then the second thing to say is that the impacts of self-esteem and just safety in yourself are huge. We told you at Zoe that impacts of literally African Americans being able to lighten their skin to some degree and then feel more safe when they drive around and see a cop car pull up behind them. The fact that Asian Americans who have double eyelids now can go into the subway station and feel more secure and not literally going to be pushed onto these subway tracks because someone looks at them and says, "You are definitely Asian and I do not like you." That is a harm they have to deal with in their next speech because they are very, very significant and visceral impacts that they ultimately have to reconcile with. Okay, the final thing to say on choice versus beauty standards is we tell you why people are able to conceptualize the risks of the operations. The fact that you know what's going to happen to you after it happens. The fact that most are reversible in some way. Thirdly, you just have consultations, no thank you, with doctors and things like that so you know what the procedure is like. We think these individuals have the capacity to make that decision for themselves. There is no harm there. Freedom of choice is incredibly important with all of the impacts about self-esteem that they themselves talk about. Sure.
The people who you say you're happy to trade off who don't have access to this surgery are the majority of people in this world who don't live in a country like Australia with Medicare.
Okay, two things to say. Firstly, obviously people in Sierra Leone aren't going to access these procedures under any world. They're probably not influenced by the beauty standards of America in any significant way. But secondly, we think the people who are most likely to be impacted by these beauty standards probably do live in the West, because that's where there's Western media and Western modeling and all the things I wanted to talk about. Obviously, we can make it more accessible for all of the reasons we gave you at Zoe, just about subsidizing it better and making it more accessible in that very specific way. Second question in this speech then. Are these procedures good? I'm going to split this up into two main groups. Firstly, the individual, and then on social and the broader minorities themselves. On the individual, they tell you that those left behind have worse self-esteem. I dealt with this mainly in my ethos, but there were two main things to say. Firstly, that those who are susceptible to beauty standards weren't impacted much by the procedures of others. But secondly, that they probably were able to discuss more broadly, and that's important. But the thing to say there is, even if these norms are as bad as they say, note why a ban fundamentally makes this worse. Because if the coercion is as bad as they say, you're probably just going to go to Thailand and get a sketchy procedure where your health is ultimately compromised in that specific way. So let's co-opt all of their material about coercion. If this is as bad and as toxic and as problematic as they tell you it is, they cannot deal with the reality of these individuals having to make an even worse choice where they cannot conceptualize the risks in a way that is important for freedom of choice in that way. On social outcomes then, they say they tell minorities what to look like. We think this probably doesn't change in either world. They haven't proven how racism changes. The difference then is practical. The fact that we allow them to exist better in society. We give them greater self-esteem. We give them the ability to find employment, to get representation and things like that. On blackfishing and fetishization, I think it's very, very important in this point to know that there are just other ways to hold these individuals accountable. Obviously, blackfishing and blackface isn't socially acceptable. There are other ways to hold these people accountable and to just use cancel culture and means like that, and I'll take you in a second, to make sure that these individuals don't do these things. Obviously, that isn't a mechanism we're way more happy to support. Yeah.
What kind of message do you send to young minorities that their only hope of getting a romantic partner or even getting a job, quotes from you and your first speaker, is through getting a race-changing surgery?
Okay, that's not what we're saying. We're saying that racism exists in society to such an extent that some individuals literally feel ostracized every single day of your life. If that is something that appeals to you as an individual, the fact that you feel less than human because of the way you look, obviously you couldn't rely on an upward trajectory or a norm shift, which meant in 50 years you could access that employment. You had a right to feel safe and to feel important and to have good self-esteem now. Even if that meant that you had to take this procedure, that was something that individual could consent to, and that was something that individual would get benefits for now. That's what mattered, that's our response. Okay, so yeah, blackfishing and fetishization, there are other ways to hold these individuals who do these things accountable. On my one point of substantive then, why we change narratives about race more generally. Under the status quo, race is seen as the ascripted trait that defines individuals. That means that firstly, people judge it on primarily and fully on what people look like. But secondly, it means that often biracial people are locked out of certain cultural elements because of the way they look. They cannot access, for example, the African American heritage because they look very white in that very specific way. Why do we change this? Firstly, because we just make appearance less critical to their overall identity. When we give people the capacity to just change the way they are, obviously you're forced to judge people more on just what their external looks are, because you know that isn't everything. The impacts and outcomes of this are colossal. It's just that incrementally you get a less racist society because people aren't able to just make first value decisions about a person's race from what they look like. That changes under our world. At the end of this speech, people had the freedom of choice to make the decision to better their lives now. They couldn't wait. So proud to oppose.
We think over the past 30 years that Australia has made quite significant progress in making sort of justice happen for Indigenous people, for actually reversing the policies of the stolen generation. We think Australia's policies of multiculturalism are beginning to shine through to a point that hundreds of years of racism are now actually being merged into a society where it's okay to be black, it's okay to have a nose that looks hooked, and it's okay to look different from what like Anglo-Saxon. The reality in this debate is what the opposition did was they created an ethno-state where race didn't exist to the extent that race was only one race, which only a certain number of people in society had access to. I'm going to do three things in this speech. Look at one, who decrease violence towards racial minorities, and look at this trade-off between acute violence and long-term progress towards destroying the superstructure of racism. Secondly, look at this question of the degradation of culture, which the opposition didn't engage with a lot. Thirdly, look at this principle of where the government should intervene and where they shouldn't intervene. Moving on to this question of who decreased violence towards racial minorities. Now, this was actually the only point that the opposition really wanted to engage with tonight. No, thank you. So we say that if we win this point, we win the debate. At first affirmative, we come up and give you two specific groups who are going to that means we decrease violence on our side of the house. We say one, it is people of a minority who alter their racial appearance to escape acute violence. Secondly, the second group, we say it's people of a racial majority who alter their appearance for personal reasons. We give the example of one-night stands. Now, the opposition don't really engage a whole lot with this second group because it's not particularly strategically smart for them to do so, but we actually say that this group was a large majority because a large number, no thank you, of people in Australian society still chose to go and wear blackface to a party, still tan their skin every single weekend. So, under this main idea, no thank you, of people of a minority who alter their appearance to escape acute violence, we have a few responses to this. Firstly, we say that they become more of a minority under the opposition side of the house. We give you the mechanism of your violence as a minority was proportional to how much of a minority in society you actually were. That's why we think larger racial minorities within society are subject to less racism than smaller racial minorities. That was our specific mechanism, and the opposition didn't engage with that specifically. The opposition come and say, okay, sure, it's a fairly legitimate mechanism, but your right to escape acute violence under the status quo exceeded any idea about destroying the long-term superstructure of racism. So, we say that if we win this point about the long-term destruction of racism and prove that the trade-off wasn't worth it, we win the debate. Here's our response to it, and here's why we win. We say, firstly, not everyone has access to it. Under the opposition side of the house. They say under this idea that they're going to put it into Medicare. We tell you specifically at second to no response that most countries don't have Medicare, and in the countries where racism is most prevalent, no thank you, these governments weren't actually capable of implementing such a policy. We bring this up in a POI at second negative, and the opposition have nothing really to say other than saying that, racial structures don't really exist in Sierra Leone. We actually think they really were, because to the extent that colonisation meant the beauty of Western ideals meant that the Anglo-Saxon ideal went to Sierra Leone, went to Nigeria, it meant that lots of people in these countries were bleaching their skin on a daily basis. No, thank you. That was a huge problem both for society in destroying their value of their culture, but also personally, because when people actually did that within these communities, they were often actually ostracised from their own societies, their own communities, because they bleached their skin white. We say, secondly, not everyone actually wants to undergo this change, and so that meant even if they were still subject to that acute violence, they had to suffer, those members of the racial minority continued to have to suffer from the other people in their racial minority going and getting that surgery. That was a greater net harm to them, and their autonomy was also violated to a large extent. we say that they are therefore marginalised more, that led to more oppression. Now, I have a few more responses to this. The idea is that the violence on this newly marginalised community was a no thank you greater net level of racism than on our side of the house. We say, one, the racism was more severe on a per capita level because you became more marginalised, you became more of a minority. Secondly, it didn't actually allow people to escape racism because we tell you that there's a fundamental gap between appearance and race. No, thank you. That is to say that most people can actually tell when someone has altered their racial appearance because simply dyeing your skin black didn't necessarily mean you possessed all the other features of looking like an African American person. So we say that there is literally a fundamental gap that even if you do want to undergo the surgery, you never actually, one, feel actually like you're culturally ingrained within this new culture in their rituals. Secondly, you weren't actually able to look even with heaps of surgery, like a person of that actual culture would. So no thank you, say that this idea of acute violence doesn't actually exist because most people can tell when it's fake and when it's actually been done intentionally. The opposition then case shift at second negative and tell you about how the discourse of beauty standards, this is at 8 minutes 10 at second negative I'd like to point out, they tell you that they get more discourse of beauty standards. We say to the extent that they do get a larger discourse about beauty standards, if that discourse is only about reinforcing the stereotype of white people as the pinnacle of beauty, we say that the discussion and discourse around beauty standards is a net harm. So even if they get more discourse, if that discourse reinforced the white ideal, and I'll take you in a second, that was not discourse that was worth the cost. Why am I wrong?
Lots of African American communities have lots of cultural heritage and significance, which means they don't want to change their appearance. But some who do, some who don't necessarily connect, would like to have a greater self-esteem. That doesn't impact the cultural group which feels good in themselves. Why is that a harm?
Because we think that you can be an African American person but still not actually engage in the rituals of your culture, right? Because you can still have the appearance but choose not to engage. But if you transitioned from a majority race to a minority race, you weren't actually able to engage in those rituals. We thought it was easy for you as a member of minority who did look like you had darker skin to choose not to partake in those cultural rituals, and it was your right to be able to choose. That was hugely important. Thirdly, under this idea of the trade-off between acute violence and long-term destruction of the superstructure of racism, we tell you that long-termism means that when the opposition allow this policy, no thank you, they backtrack on all the progress that Australia has made in becoming a more multicultural and more accepting society. Lastly, the opposition tell you this trade-off. They use the example of now you can go get a job, so that was worth the cost. We have two responses. One, it's about the accessibility of this policy. I've already addressed that. Secondly, no thank you, that it was the people of these racial minorities weren't actually able to access this stuff, even if you put it into Medicare, because the majority of countries didn't have it. So, at the end of this point, I've actually proven that the trade-off, no thank you, between acute violence and the long-term destruction of the superstructure of racism didn't exist because people were able to actually tell whether this was actually intentional surgery or whether it was fake. That was hugely important and we'd really like a response at third negative, but to be honest, we think it's a bit too late. Secondly, under this idea of cultural degradation, the opposition don't actually engage with it because they only say to the extent that they reduce violence, they didn't care about the destruction of culture. We actually thought culture was hugely important for those that choose to actually identify with their culture. It gave you a sense of community, and it actually, when you implemented this policy, it led to huge cultural erosion. This was a huge substantive point we bring to you at second, to no response other than the opposition saying the trade-off between acute violence and the destruction of culture was worth it because you've already got a job. I've already given you 7 minutes of analysis why that wasn't true, but this idea of cultural degradation still stood. We would like a response on that one. Lastly, under this idea of the principle, the opposition bring you this principle that it was morally wrong for the government to intervene in matters of race and gender and things like that. We tell you that there is a threshold harm to which the government had an obligation to act. That's why we have you couldn't call up a person of colour on the phone and start spewing hate speech. The government had hate speech laws. That's why freedom of speech wasn't in the UN Charter of Human Rights, because we recognise that there is a threshold harm to which the government had to intervene. At the end of this speech, I've proven that the trade-off between acute violence and long-term destruction of racism wasn't a benefit of their side, and the opposition had a very defensive case, and that's why they couldn't actually engage with this idea of cultural degradation, or when the government had an obligation to intervene or not, and that's why we are so proud to return.
Problem with running 8 minutes of mitigation at the third half about why not everyone was able to access this was twofold. Firstly, because they never proved that people that actively did get this surgery were not dramatically benefited. Secondly, they've claimed that they solve beauty standards is still unsubstantiated. We're going to actually provide a link in this speech as to why they make beauty standards worse. And thirdly, I'm actually just going to flip all of this anyway and prove why actually we improve cultures, because when we get some people in power structures, that means we can support the most marginalized people within them as well. Okay, so 3 issues in this speech. I'm going to start by talking about people getting these surgeries. Why do we think, so what was their main claim here? Their first claim that they wanted to talk about was that not everyone is able to access these, and the point that they make here is like, they say that in Sierra Leone you're not going to have Medicare. The first thing to note is I think that white beauty standards are at least comparatively more prevalent in mostly white countries. I think that means that you're more likely to need to worry about this in situations like the US or the UK or Australia, where you are comparatively far more likely to have accessible healthcare. We're also just prepared to just make this more accessible anyway, no thank you. Thirdly, I think that also at the point at which we make it more accessible in some places, that naturally leads to it being more accessible in others. I think that was mitigatory at best, because it only proved that some people couldn't access it, but secondly, I think it was flawed mitigation because I think we can get it to everyone. What were the impacts then when we did get it to you? That was the fact that functionally, you were likely to be treated better. They say you're still going to have some aspects of your character that you are still determined by. That doesn't change the fact that a large majority of them are not. No thank you. Because if I'm walking past someone on the street and they look a certain way, I'm not necessarily going to have a conversation with them, but I'm already making assumptions based on their appearance. We're able, no thank you, to at very least change that, and that's incredibly important, because that means we solve huge numbers of microaggressions that people face every single day when they're walking on the street or taking the subway to work. That doesn't require you to have a conversation with someone, no thank you. That just requires you to be racist, and now you're less likely to be so. But additionally, additionally, what we think we're able to get is we're able to get people that are more able to exist within power structures. Because I think that even if you are still somewhat likely to be identified in a racial way, you're comparatively less likely to face racial vilification, no thank you, when people are considering who they want to hire or not, when you're able to look comparatively more white or more like a majoritarian group. That means that comparatively, you're more likely to get employed under our side and all of those benefits. But what were the benefits of that? That was the point at which they didn't provide a mechanism as to why, if the world was so problematically racist, they were ever able to get someone that was incredibly visually, no thank you, and functionally part of a racial minority into a power structure in the first place. I think if they could get that, that was just the status quo right now anyway, and we were able to co-opt that as well. That was the weird part about that case shift at the start of third act that meant that if this was a positive trajectory, no thank you, that was a positive trajectory when these things existed anyway. But why do we think that even if we buy that they are very vulnerable? Okay. If you are incredibly vulnerable and very difficult to get a job, that meant that the best thing you could do was make yourself as similar to what someone wanted to hire as possible. That meant that the best thing to do was to make yourself at least comparatively more white. But what were the impacts of that? That meant that as soon as one person was able to get voted into parliament, or one person was able to get into a boardroom, they could then advocate for every single other person that they related to. Because it's true that even though you might not look like a certain ethnicity anymore, no thank you, you were still born into these circumstances of, for example, things like generational poverty, or being born in an area that has a poor public school, or all of those elements. You were still, no thank you, going to relate to those harms, and you were far more able to advocate against those harms when you were able to get someone in power in the first place. And note, that's incredibly important, because that's why it's not actually true that just being more of a minority means you suffer more harm. If we were able to actively get potentially a smaller minority, but literally have a voice that could advocate for them on a global, or at least like a policy scale at some level, and I'll take that in a second, that was a comparative win for everyone, sure.
When you allow people to change their racial appearance, you allow people to escape the root cause of racism and backtrack on all of society's progress that we've made.
Okay, cool. We allowed them to escape the root cause of racism. That seems like a really big win for our side. Secondly, I don't think you do erase all of the benefits that we've got as society, because all of the benefits you talk about of things like progressive change that means that we've had better policy exist under the status quo in which these procedures do exist. I think we're allowed to have all of the positive trajectory that means that you do, if you do really significantly identify with your cultural heritage, you can just choose not to take them. That was a valid choice that many people were already taking, no thank you. That was a huge benefit. But the next thing I'd like to talk about here is something that they haven't responded to at all, which is that if it's true that this is so coercive, and if it's true that you are really coerced into doing this, they haven't given a reason why it's more safe to take it when it is not allowed. And that's incredibly important, because I think that functionally, even if, no thank you, taking this is very bad, for yourself and for your community, it was still better that you did so in a circumstance that meant that you were less likely to die while you were taking the procedure anyway. An additional thing, just touching on Bella Hadid, I think it's far easier for someone to complain about their parents forcing them to take a procedure when you're not scared of being prosecuted for having taken the procedure in the first place. You're able to get a lot more discourse and a lot more backlash towards things like blackfishing under our side because it's a lot easier for people to talk about it. That was why we were able to watch that. So at the end of this point, what I think I've proven is, firstly, if you take this procedure, you live a better life, you are less likely to get vilified. Secondly, even if that was not true, it was still, no thank you, safer to take it under our side. Thirdly, I was able to prove that even if you were not the person taking the procedure, you still got the benefits of having someone taking it. At this point, I think that we've very much proven that we get less violence. On the second issue about why we're able to get better beauty standards, sure.
How do you engage with the 8 minutes I've just given you about how everyone can notice when racial appearance is surgically altered? Your benefits about escaping racism didn't exist.
Because I already told you that you could still comparatively look more white, and also I think that just you can comparatively see, I think that a lot of what you were talking about was reliant on things such as having a conversation or understanding someone's personality or their culture on a deep level, which wasn't something you did when you just sat opposite you on a train or walked past you on the street, because that was the sphere in which a very large amount of microaggressions existed. Okay, let's talk about beauty standards. They talk about a lot of things that are very important, because I think beauty standards do exist. I think they're very pernicious. I think they do exist in things such as media, in modeling and production of products. But I think what's also true is the reason why they exist is the people that control huge beauty empires tend to be white men, because that's just how patriarchal and racist power structures exist within society. That means that I think the only reason why you get any models from minority backgrounds at all under the status quo is that they're able to look comparatively more white. What I think the effects of that are is that when you don't allow people to comparatively look more white, you just don't hire anyone in those spheres whatsoever. I think that means we get more models of color. Note that we also therefore get all of the carry-on benefits, no thank you, that I've already substantiated about the fact that that means that we're able to get them to advocate for other people of those minorities. That's why we were able to get better beauty standards, because we were able to have at least some aspects of black beauty be considered beautiful, rather than you literally needing to be, as they wanted to characterize, the most British person possible. I don't even think that's very attractive, and I'm British. Anyway, I think that what we should establish at the end of this point is that what we get is that everything that they want to talk about beauty standards actively relied on them providing a mechanism as to why beauty standards were uniquely created by these sort of surgeries and therefore could be fixed by banning them. That wasn't true, because the power structures already existed. These beauty standards had existed for centuries, if not millennia. Therefore, the best way to solve them was not to remove one thing that existed, but to actively allow people to exist within these structures, because you needed to change them from the inside. That was what we allowed. Lastly, I think we also were able to establish, and the last thing to establish here is that even if you buy literally nothing else in this debate, you had a right to make a choice on your bodily autonomy. That was also uniquely debate winning, because that was just something that you could never trade off for any practical benefits or harms. You just had a right to your own body. At the end of this speech, we proved that you had a choice to this. We proved that that this was an actively good choice. We proved that even if this was a bad choice, the active action of banning it made it worse. We won on every possible stakeholder. We won this debate.
Simple questions for this reply. Firstly, which side gets better outcomes for individuals in this debate? And secondly, which side best combats beauty standards? On the first, individuals. A big push made from the side of opposition in this debate is the accessibility of these treatments. We told you a few things. Firstly, it's probably important to note that an argument of accessibility doesn't actually mean that the thing you're accessing is bad. That's probably attention. Secondly, we told you that beauty standards aren't often as prevalent in the places that they wanted to talk about. Places like Sierra Leone and the north of Africa and places like that aren't perceptible to Western beauty standards because they don't have things like lots of Western media, lots of Western modeling and things like that. They didn't have the same kind of pressures that people in the West did. Secondly, we told you at Harry crucially that we probably make things more accessible in the long term at the point at which we start to roll them out now. That was incredibly important, because if it meant that they themselves agreed that these things were good, but the harm is that they were inaccessible, the way you made things inaccessible was just by slowly, gradually rolling it out and meaning that more people could access them in that way. So, because we've proven that it's accessible, why do we ultimately get lots of individual benefits for most people in this debate? Side proposition continually refused to engage with the reality of the status quo, which means people of color are vilified and discriminated against every single day. We told you that when you gave the ones who wanted to integrate better and who wanted to escape racism in that way could access things like treatments that led to benefits for them that were colossal. literally having less microaggressions when you walked to work, being able to access employment that was otherwise inaccessible to you, just being able to exist in society without feeling vilified because of the very specific way you look. It was a terrible panel that racism existed under the status quo, but they never gave you a mechanism for how to fix it, which meant every single person who was discriminated against under the status quo were left to be vilified by side proposition's own material. But secondly, we told you that we literally gave you mechanisms at Harry as to why we changed things like representation. That's to say, when you got people of colour who maybe lightened their skin into positions of power, they were able to advocate for every other member of that group because they had the shared experiences. They knew fundamentally what people of colour went through, and they could be better able to fix those problems because now they were in that seat and that position. So at the end of this point, it is crucial to know that it was accessible and that it led to individual impacts. But even if it didn't, even if these procedures were worse, let's co-opt all of their material about coercion to prove why a ban made it fundamentally more harmful. This meant these individuals were going to go to places like Thailand where the procedures were worse. They were going to access them on places like the black market, where they were going to lead to worse health harms, which probably destroyed that individual and that they couldn't consent to. So at the end of individuals, we made things accessible. We made things better for that individual, but even if we didn't, their ban made things actively worse. That wasn't acceptable. Second question was replied then. So let's talk about beauty standards. Again, important to know that they are super oppressive, but they don't fix them. So the question then becomes, who works better within them? On representation, we told you at Harry that for models of colour and for individuals who want to succeed in that way, the only way they get that representation is through unfortunately conforming to those beauty standards. We think having people of colour be models is important. We only got it under our side. But also, we give you multiple pushes about freedom of choice, about why you can consent, why you can conceptualise the risks, why you can reverse that procedure, why you know what's going to happen. Their only response down the bench was to say why harms can be accrued to others. We give you a number of responses. Firstly, in a POI, we tell you that lots of cultural groups have intents like heritage and have a great pride within themselves, so they're probably not going to be impacted by the decision of others. They're probably going to stay the same. But secondly, that individuals who aren't ultimately deserve that choice. Thirdly, that people who were perceptible to the decisions of others were probably perceptible to beauty standards in and of themselves. The impact of decisions of others probably doesn't change them. But fourthly and finally, the fact that you just opened up discussion about what people were insecure about in very specific ways was something only we achieved. That's when you actively changed people's minds. At the end of this speech, at the end of this debate, what mattered most was that individuals felt empowered, that individuals had the ability to walk down the street and feel better about themselves. We couldn't rely on an upward trajectory. Change needed to happen now. So proud to oppose.
Opposition loses this debate because not only were they not making a valid trade-off, but they didn't get a benefit out of the trade-off anyway. They told you that the benefits to the people who undergo these procedures outweighed the harms to those who didn't. This means if we proved in this debate a harm to those who underwent procedures, their entire case falls down. So why did we prove that? They told us a few things: that people were able to escape discrimination and that now they could get jobs high up so they could make policy. Their critical failure in this point was that they refused to engage with reality, where Anglo-Saxons who didn't face racial discrimination also underwent this procedure. That was something we told you was empirically true at second, that people took certain aspects of minority racial ethnicities and used them to racially change their appearance. That meant there was a huge group of people who underwent these procedures, who felt insecure about how they looked, who felt as if they weren't beautiful just the way they were, who they didn't benefit at all in their world because they refused to acknowledge them at any speaker. But why did the people who they told you were escaping discrimination and could now get jobs, why were they harmed in their world anyway? We gave you 4 reasons. Firstly, because you didn't look the same when you underwent these racial appearance procedures. Because you were never going to look genuinely Anglo-Saxon when you were Indigenous and you underwent racially changing appearances. That meant that you didn't actually get a benefit because you weren't able to access those jobs anyway, because there were people who looked more white than you. But secondly, because they gave these people the feeling that they couldn't be who they were and that they had to change in order to get any accessibility to success within society. Instead, we told you that in our world, and we told you from first down the bench, that the world was becoming more racially progressive, which meant that multiculturalism was allowing the core of the problem to be addressed when more people got into power naturally, when naturally people of racial minorities were being accepted. In opposition's world, what they did was they perpetuated the norm that has existed historically of only being beautiful and successful if you were white. Yes, we didn't solve every beauty standard and create a utopia in our world, but what we prevented was the regression that opposition got in theirs. But let's say you don't believe any of that. Why, even if they benefit these people and allow them to escape discrimination, was it not a valid trade-off for them to make? Because we told you there was a huge impact on people who didn't undergo these procedures. We told you this was a lot of people for 3 reasons. That this was a debate that took place around the world and not every country was going to have access to these procedures. Second, that the most vulnerable people in every country didn't have access to these procedures because they were financially vulnerable and further disenfranchised from society and faced that horrible intersectionality. But thirdly, that some people just didn't want to change who they were and it was okay for them to not change who they were. They tell us that only Western countries have Western beauty standards. We told you from first that media was global and that this perpetuated Western beauty standards, and we told you at third that colonialism around the world was a huge issue within this debate. This meant there was a huge harm they had to bear in this debate, when only white people could now get in power in their world, where only people who looked Anglo-Saxon could be beautiful. All of these people were further disenfranchised. This brings down their point about freedom of speech because these people were harmed when they didn't consent to other people getting procedures, when they were further ostracized from society because they were not deemed successful or beautiful. We win this debate in both readings of tonight's debate.